Hello everyone, good afternoon. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the 23rd seminar in Phase 4 of our International Interdisciplinary PhD in Progress weekly seminar series organized by the GlobalSouth Network. Before we begin, I would like to thank Dr. Nauman Reyet, a lecturer in law at Leicester Law School, and also the founder and chief convener of the GlobalSouth Network for organizing this weekly seminar series. I am Dr. Tony Raymond Kirabira. I'll be chairing today's session. I'm a lecturer at the Department of Law, Justice and Policing, University of East London. I'm also a qualified legal practitioner and have previously worked as a visiting professional in the Office of Public Counsel for Victims at the ICC in regards to extensive legal practice in Uganda and in East Africa. I'm currently the Vice Chair of the Ugandan Law Society's Research and Publications Committee. I'm joined by two discussants and a peer commentator. The first discussant, Dr. Pearl Karuhanga Atuhaire. She's previously worked in the field of sexual and gender-based violence, specialist at the United Nations Women in Liberia. She has a PhD in public administration, Peace and Conflict Studies from Durban University of Technology in South Africa, and a master's degree in international relations and diplomatic studies from Makerere University in Uganda. She was a 2017 Women in International Security Next Generation Gender, Peace and Security Fellow. She has contributed to various reports, including United Nations Institute of Peace Special Report on Sexual Violence during and after conflict and Women in International Security Policy Brief. Dr. David Eichert is the second discussant for today's session. Previously, he was a visiting scholar at the Paris Human Rights Center and at the Center for International Criminal Justice at Vrije University in Amsterdam. He has taught at Sciences Po at the American University of France. In his PhD research, Dr. Eichert built upon post-structural feminist and queer international relations theory to trace how prosecutors, diplomats, judges, and NGOs interpret claims of sexual violence. As a case study, he examined the role of gendered narratives in justice efforts for the Rohingya genocide, including the ongoing cases in The Hague. He is also published extensively in his specialty. And then also we've got Pilar Sánchez Bellosta, who is a peer commentator for today's session. Pilar is a DPhil candidate in politics and international relations at the University of Oxford, supported by the Nuffield College and under the Economic and Social Research Council funding. Her research explores how conflict-related sexual violence influences legislation on violence against women in Africa using quantitative and comparative approach. Last but not least, today's guest speaker, Sara Ciucci, who is an Economic, Social and Science Research Council PhD student at the School of Law, University of Nottingham. Her PhD research focuses on the intersection between conflict-related sexual violence and terrorism, with an emphasis on the challenges and perspectives of accountability at both the national and supranational levels. Previously, Sara worked as a research associate for different research projects at the Rights Lab Beacon of Excellence of University of Nottingham. Since 2021, she has been working as a research assistant for a series of projects focused on the prospects for justice for sexual and gender-based survivors in northern Uganda. Today, Sara will be presenting part of a PhD project titled Exploring Pathways to Justice to address the nexus between conflict-related sexual violence and terrorism in Uganda. Sara, you will have 30 minutes for your presentation, followed by 5 minutes for comments and questions from the discussants and the peer commentator. If time permits, which I hope it should, we will have a 15-minute Q&A session with the attendees. The screen is now yours, Sara.
Thank you so much, Tony, for the introduction. Okay, my name is Sara Ciucci, and I'm a second-year PhD student at the University of Nottingham in the UK. My PhD thesis focuses on exploring pathways to justice to address the nexus between conflict-related sexual violence and terrorism, with a specific focus in Uganda. So in my presentation today, I will provide some background information on the issue of the nexus between conflict-related sexual violence and terrorism. I will then offer an overview of the objectives and methodology of my research and provide some information on the context of the case study to situate the discussion. Then I will offer an overview of the fieldwork that I recently conducted in Uganda, and in the end I will present some preliminary findings that have emerged from the analysis of the data collected so far. Starting from the issue of the object of the research, which is the nexus between conflict-related sexual violence and terrorism. Over the last few decades, there has been a significant increase in the incidence of terrorist groups. Terrorists have become more capable of committing widespread and devastating acts of violence, and this rise has led to the development of new forms of terrorism beyond the classical manifestations, for example, bombings or hijackings, including forms of sexual and gender-based violence. At the same time, non-state actors are recognized as the predominant perpetrators of sexual violence during armed conflicts. The last report of the UN Secretary General, the last annual report on conflict-related sexual violence, which was published in April 2024, lists 58 parties credibly suspected or responsible for committing acts of conflict-related sexual violence. And among these, at least 1 out of 4 is a terrorist group. We could think, for example, of ISIS in Iraq and Syria, Boko Haram in Nigeria, Al-Shabaab in Somalia, Ansar Din and Al-Qaeda in Mali, DLRA in Central African Republic, Democratic Republic of Congo, and South Sudan. And the proliferation of terrorist groups in contexts which are already destabilized by conflict intensifies forms of sexual and gender-based violence, with women and girls disproportionately affected. So during my first year of my PhD, I used the Sexual Violence in Armed Conflict database, the SVAC database, and I examined a sample of 14 non-state terrorist groups perpetrating sexual violence between 1989 and 2021. And I conducted a qualitative analysis of common patterns of sexual and gender-based violence among these groups. What I found is all the examining group engage in rape, even though there are some differences in their execution and frequency. In the vast majority of groups, instances of rape have occurred with a clear link to other forms of sexual violence. So the recourse to act of mere rape, for example, rape during attacks or incursions on villages or immediately following the seizure of a territory by the group, has generally been less frequent in favor of more institutionalized forms of sexual violence. There is therefore a trend across almost the observed group, which is the use of forced marriages, sexual slavery, or sexual exploitation through sex markets, or a combination of these different acts. But also the employment of these forms of institutionalized sexual violence typically leads to further reproductive sexual violence. So forced pregnancies are generally linked to forced marriages, while sexual slavery, forced birth control and abortion are generally linked to sexual slavery and sex markets. In theory, when we consider sexual violence in a situation of conflict, there is always a sort of tension between individual versus organized perpetration of sexual violence. But based on what I observe, first of all, we could say that the widespread occurrence of sexual violence among the group challenges the idea of attributing this violence solely to individuals and reinforces the perception that it is not an individualized, random, or opportunistic act of violence. But it is even more the fact that the sexual violence is institutionalized that leads to the conclusion that this is not an individual act, but it is an act that is organized in its nature. In addition, each group uses a combination of different motivation behind acts of sexual violence. So on the one hand, there are instrumental objectives. So for example, military and logistics objectives such as destroying and displacing communities or gaining information, recruiting fighters, or financial motivation, for example, increase funds, for instance, through revenues from sex markets. But at the same time, there are always ideological motivation, for example, the aim to breed a new generation, to exert ideological control over a population, punish opposite ideology, or promote forced conversion. So, based on the fact that there is this interplay between ideological and instrumental motivation, along with the fact that terrorist groups generally target specific individuals, that reinforces the idea that sexual violence is employed strategically by terrorist groups. So we could conclude that sexual violence operates as a deliberate and organized strategy of terrorist groups. So moving now to what are the main objectives and the methodology of my research. So despite the fact that there is a widespread and strategic use of sexual violence among terrorist groups, there is still a gap in terms of prosecuting this interconnected criminality. The fact that there is no adequate prosecution of conflict-related sexual violence as a tactic of terrorism does not ensure accountability for those responsible and does not recognize the full extent of the crimes that are suffered by the victims. But even more, this may increase the repeated use of sexual violence as a deliberate strategy of terrorist groups. So the main aim of my research is, first of all, to identify the current legislative, investigative, and prosecutorial barriers, and also to explore the best approach to judicially prosecute conflict-related sexual violence employed by terrorist groups. To do so, I will be using a social legal methodology. So specifically, I will employ legal pluralism as the framework for my research. I will conduct a case study based on Uganda, and I will conduct qualitative research using both semi-structured interviews and focus groups. With regard to the legal pluralism, I will be looking at the criminal justice systems in a pluralist lens. So I will be focusing on both the formal and the informal criminal justice system at different levels. In terms of the formal criminal justice system, I will be looking at the international, regional, and national level, including both the exercise of territorial and extraterritorial jurisdiction. And in terms of the informal criminal justice system, I will be looking at the local system of justice, so for example, traditional justice mechanisms. And to evaluate the criminal justice approaches across these different levels of the criminal justice system, I have developed 4 criteria for evaluation. First of all, I will be looking at institutional capacity with a particular focus on the collection and gathering of evidence, investigative and prosecutorial skills available, the ability to cooperate and prioritize sexual gender-based violence and terrorism effectively, as well as the robustness of the adjudicative structure. The second criteria is fair labeling in the sense of accuracy of charges and proportionality of sentences. The third criteria is the ability to prove elements of crime, including contextual elements of crime, for example, the intent of terrorism, requirement for corroboration and consent, especially in relation to sexual and gender-based violence, and the ability to prove the organizational element. And the last criteria is the respect for victims' rights. And in this sense, I will be focusing on three main areas: participation, protection, and reparation for victims. Moving now to the context of the case study, Uganda serves as an important example of the nexus between terrorism and sexual and gender-based violence, in particular in relation to two different situations within the country. So the first situation is the conflict in northern Uganda that occurred between 1986 and 2006 that involved the Law Resistance Army, the LRA, fighting against the Uganda government. The LRA was responsible for widespread human rights violation, including systematic sexual violence, and in particular, women and girls, but even males, were subjected to repeated forms of sexual violence, including abductions, forced marriages, and forced reproduction. In the last 2 decades, northern Uganda has experienced a transition from a situation of conflict to a situation of post-conflict. Since that point, the LRA has disappeared from the country. This transition provides a timely opportunity to reflect on the idea of justice and to examine how justice mechanisms can address the legacy of violence and provide justice for victims of sexual and gender-based violence. But at the same time, the LRA is still active in neighboring countries, including the Democratic Republic of Congo, Central African Republic, and South Sudan. So the issue of justice, even in this other country, is particularly pressing. The second situation concerns instead Western Uganda and the Allied Democratic Forces, ADF, that operates along the border of Uganda and the Democratic Republic of Congo. Originally based in Western Uganda, the group has expanded into the eastern part of DRC, and the activities of the ADF mirror to some of the patterns seen with regards to the crimes committed by the LRA, and among others include, for example, killings, kidnapping, forced recruitment, and different forms of sexual violence. Another characteristic is the fact that in the recent years, the activities of the ADF have increasingly been claimed in the name of the Islamic State group. So for all these reasons, I thought that Uganda was a very good case study for my research. Moving now to the fieldwork, the first step of my fieldwork involved obtaining ethics approval in Uganda. This required 2 steps. First, securing approval through a Uganda university. I obtained approval through Gulu University, which is based in the northern part of Uganda. Obtaining ethics approval in Uganda was the first challenge of my fieldwork. Indeed, it took me 2 months to obtain ethics approval from Gulu University, and then other 2 months to obtain final clearance from the Uganda National Council for Science and Technology. So for this reason, it took me like around 4 or 5 months to reach the final stage of the ethics approval, and I had to postpone my fieldwork. Originally, I was supposed to leave for my fieldwork in October, November 2024, but in the end I had to postpone to the new year. But after obtaining ethics approval, I was able to travel to Uganda, and I spent there approximately 7 to 8 weeks between mid-January until early March 2025. In terms of the objectives of the fieldwork, the primary objective of the fieldwork was to deepen the understanding of how the intersection between terrorism and conflict-related sexual violence is addressed, specifically from an investigative, prosecutorial, and judicial perspective. And to achieve this purpose, I conducted key informant interviews with different stakeholders involved in the legal and judicial process. The second key objective was to amplify the perspective of survivors around justice and accountability for conflict-related sexual violence linked to terrorism. And to gather this perspective, I have facilitated focus group discussion with survivors. And overall, based on the information gathered through the key informant interviews and the focus group discussion, the main purpose of the fieldwork is to identify the best mechanism or the best way to address the intersection between the two crimes and develop some context-specific recommendation to improve justice responses in Uganda, but even more broadly in other conflict and post-conflict settings. So in terms of access and engagement of participants, first of all, I leveraged my prior research research experience in the country. This was not my first trip in Uganda. I had been to Uganda twice before going there for my fieldwork for another research project, and this allowed me to navigate the local context more effectively. This was essential in understanding the cultural, social, and logistical aspects, and to facilitate better interaction with local communities of survivors and even the other stakeholders involved in the interviews. Secondly, I collaborated with a gatekeeper organization based in northern Uganda, GWEDGI, Gulu Women Economic Development and Globalization, which had persisting links with survivors group in the community, but also with high-level stakeholders based in Gulu and Kampala. Also, to ensure that the data collected was carried out in a sensitive and confidential manner, identified safe, accessible location for engaging with survivors and other key stakeholders. I took all the steps to guarantee confidentiality by obtaining informed consent from the participant before the data collection, and also to address the language barriers. I made use of local interpretation support, mostly for focus group discussion, to ensure that all the participants could understand the question being asked and could express themselves fully in their native language. So during my fieldwork, I conducted 3 focus group discussions in Gulu district. The first group was composed by children born of war, both males and females over the age of 18, so we could refer to them as youth born of war. And then I conducted 2 other focus group discussions with survivors. The first group including both males and female survivors of conflict-related sexual violence, while the second group was exclusively composed by women. And in total, I engaged with 29 participants across the 3 focus groups. Among these, 20 were females and 9 were males. Also, I conducted 46 key informant interviews with different groups of stakeholders, 7 different groups, specifically traditional and community leaders, government officials, legal practitioners, civil society actors, researchers and academics, representatives from independent bodies based in Uganda, and staff from international organizations and other entities based outside Uganda. As you can see from the pie chart, the biggest category is the category of government officials. I interviewed 23 participants within this category with a different range of representatives from different institutions. These included members of parliament and parliamentary legal services, members of the Uganda police force, and within this category I engage with participants from specialized units within the force, for example the Child and Family Protection Department, Forensic Services, Sexual and Gender-Based Violence and Human Trafficking Department, and Criminal Investigation Directorate. I also conducted interviews with technical advisors from the Justice, Law and Order Secretariat, specifically with the technical advisor on criminal justice and also on transitional justice. I had interviews with judiciary from the criminal division of the Eichert and from the International Crimes Division, officials from the Office of the Director of the Public Prosecution, and officials from the Office of the Attorney General. So now I would like to provide a brief overview of some of the preliminary findings. I'm still in the process of analyzing the data collected, so these are just some preliminary findings on what are the main trends based on the data that I collected. So first of all, one important insight from the findings is that participants preliminarily define terrorism based on the nature of the acts committed, so acts that instill fear and insecurity within the community, rather than based on the identity, characteristic, or ideology of the group involved. Bombings and mass killings were commonly cited as typical acts of terrorism, according to participants, but participants also described abductions, forced recruitment, and the use of forced marriages and forced reproduction as acts of terrorism. So this perspective was reflected in the way that the the different groups in Uganda were labeled by participants. So while the Allied Democratic Forces was typically referred to as a terrorist group, the LRA was more often described as a rebel group. However, the majority of participants viewed specific acts carried out by both these groups, for example, as I mentioned, abduction, forced recruitment, forced marriages, forced reproduction, as forms of terrorism. And this reveals a sort of conceptual convergence between conflict-related sexual violence and terrorism, and highlights the recognition of certain forms of conflict-related sexual violence, not only as mere consequences of the conflict, but as deliberate strategies of terror during the conflict. In terms of investigating the nexus between conflict-related sexual violence and terrorism in Uganda, participants stressed two main strengths in the investigative system. First of all, the existence of specialized investigative units, including the Counter-Terrorism Directorate and a special department focusing on sexual and gender-based violence and human trafficking within the Criminal Investigation Directorate, and also a high level of cooperation and coordination among these directorates and departments. However, several challenges remain. Victims tend to underreport crimes due to insecurity, fear of reprisal, and stigma arising from being considered victims of sexual violence, but also the risk of being associated with terrorist groups. Sexual and gender-based violence is generally not prioritized within terrorist investigations. And these crimes are often considered in isolation as a standalone offenses, and there is little attention on the dynamics and implication of their intersection. So investigators tend to focus on either one crime or the other. In terms of prosecuting the nexus between the two crimes, it is clear how sexual and gender-based violence is often overlooked in terrorism cases. One of the reasons is the fact that the Anti-Terrorist Act of 2022 of Uganda does not have an explicit provision for sexual and gender-based violence within it. And in addition, terrorism seems to be framed primarily as a crime against the state, which leads to the overlooking of sexual and gender-based violence and limits the attention to the specific crimes that are experienced by the victims. In principle, cumulative charges, so a combination of different charges, for example, from different legal framework, is theoretically possible. So a combination of charges of terrorism and sexual and gender-based violence could be possible, but this has not been applied in practice within Uganda. During the recent years, there has been a growing use of cumulative charges for cases involving human trafficking and terrorism. The reason is because human trafficking is seen as easier to prosecute compared to sexual and gender-based violence due to its more straightforward legal categorization and the existing framework. While this is somehow considered an innovative way to address some of the acts of sexual and gender-based violence, for example, it could cover abductions for forced marriages. This does not cover the prosecution of all the range of acts of sexual and gender-based violence. Lastly, in terms of the perceived needs to charge sexual and gender-based violence and/or terrorism, participants clearly emphasize the need to charge sexual and gender-based violence alongside broad charges of terrorism, for example, membership to the terrorist groups or support to the group. However, in those cases where there is a prosecution for conflict-related sexual violence linked to terrorism under core international crimes, for example, war crimes or crimes against humanity, provided that these crimes explicitly include charges of sexual and gender-based violence, this is considered by participants as adequate. For example, in the Coelho case at the International Crime Division, where there is no prosecution for terrorism, but there is prosecution for core international crimes, there is a prevailing view among participants that there is no need to add a separate terrorist charges because the severity of the crimes is already sufficiently addressed through core international crimes. In terms of adjudicative structure, during the key informant interviews and the focus group discussion, much of the discussion focused around two main institutions. On the one hand, the International Criminal Court at the international level, and on the other hand, the International Crimes Division as a domestic court within Uganda. The subject matter jurisdiction of the two courts only differs slightly. Indeed, while the International Criminal Court can only try war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide, but it doesn't not have jurisdiction over terrorism, the International Crimes Division has a broader jurisdiction that includes terrorism, human trafficking, and other serious international crimes. So, the International Criminal Court, particularly with reference to the Dominican Guen case, was generally viewed by participants as a more reliable, with better funding and stronger procedural framework. However, it also faced some criticism, in particular the lack of local language translation, the selectivity of who is included in the proceedings, and the limited follow-up after the conclusion of the case, and which raised concern about the long-term impact of the case on the communities. In contrast, the International Crimes Division, and particularly the recent trial of Thomas Quoyello, was appreciated for its specialization in handling international crimes, especially in comparison to ordinary courts, and the fact that it provides for victims' participation and reparations. However, challenges include delays in proceedings, resource constraint, and limited training for personnel. The International Crime Division struggle with a high turnover rate of judges and the lack of permanent specialized staff, which undermine the ability to develop consistent expertise in dealing with complex crime and their intersection. And another critical issue is the absence of regulation in terms of victims' participation and reparation, and the lack of witnesses protection measure, in particular due to gaps in infrastructure and the legal framework. To conclude, the concept of justice among participants, justice for the nexus between conflict-related sexual violence and terrorism, is understood broadly. Retributive justice alone is not sufficient for addressing the complexities of conflict-related sexual violence linked to terrorism. Participants emphasize that justice must include reparations, reconciliation, and healings for victims, in addition to holding the perpetrator accountable. While participants acknowledge the importance of justice at all levels, so the international, national, and local level, there is a strong emphasis on the need for localized justice, that is justice that is tailored to the unique context and the needs of the affected community. The participants advocate for victim-centered, participatory, and culturally resonant justice processes that prioritize the voices and experiences of victims. And in this context, in the context of formal justice, informal justice, so traditional justice mechanisms are seen as complementary to rather than a replacement for formal justice system. So, as I mentioned before, overall, the broad aim of my research is to inform practical recommendation for investigative, prosecutorial, and judicial mechanism, and suggest reforms in terms of the legislative framework to address conflict-related sexual violence linked to terrorism in Uganda. However, using a comparative approach, the research also seeks to draw conclusions that extend beyond Uganda. This is particularly relevant for neighboring countries, for example, South Sudan, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Central African Republic, where the LRA, for example, still operate, but even other African countries such as Somalia, Nigeria, and Mali. And however, the findings may also have some implication beyond the African continent, for example, to situation in the Middle East. So this is the end of my presentation, and thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for that enriching presentation and for keeping within the time. So we'll have the first discussant, Dr. Pearl Atuhaire. And then after that, shortly, we'll have David, and then we will have the peer commentator.
Thank you, Dr. Chiravila, and I'm pleased to be part of this panel discussion. And thank you so much to Sarah for your compelling and thought-provoking presentation. For me, this is very significant research that addresses a long-standing and underexplored nexus between conflict-related sexual violence and, of course, terrorism, particularly in our context here in Uganda. It's very challenging, it's very sensitive a topic, and it's good to see that it's being interrogated. And Sarah, well done to that effect. So I have a few comments, and probably they're already addressed, but just so that we can discuss this further, or you could strengthen on your research further. Looking at the methodology, I would like to comment on the data sources and survivor-centeredness, which is the survivor-centered approach. And maybe to also mention that I'm very passionate about this topic because currently working on SGBV in the Asia Pacific context, but also having researched in the same area on justice processes with the ICC, looking at the ICC and the peace processes in northern Uganda particularly, and of course looking at the LRA war or conflict. So I'm happy to be contributing to this, Sarah. Regarding the data sources, I was wondering if you're using survivor-centered testimonies or court transcripts or NGO reports. I would like to see more of elaboration on the ethical considerations around survivor privacy, traumas, how were they addressed, and also exploring survivors' voices and their lived experiences. I think it's very, very important how they navigate justice pathways amidst stigma, because stigma has been there, especially for those who were, for instance, wives of the former rebels, should I say, and of course issues of insecurity and institutional inertia, which would help to move the research beyond the narrow legal analysis towards a gender transformative lens on justice. So if you could look into that more. And was wondering if you're also considering feminist legal methods or participatory approaches to enrich your study, because I believe that this would help to interrogate more power relations and would help also identify how state securitization practices often, silence survivors or neglect survivors' voices. So I think using feminist legal methods would also be really key to be a part of your research. Then when we go to the policy implications, I am happy to see that you're looking at both the international, versus the domestic implications to that. But I think that we may wish to elaborate further on how the Uganda's Anti-Terrorism Act and ICC aligned statutes either support or complicate the prosecution of CRSV when linked to acts of terrorism. I know that you've mentioned that there is a gap in the Anti-Terrorism Act where it's not actually pointing out a section on addressing SGBV, in this context, but probably strengthening that component would be key. And are these cases being framed primarily as terrorism, if you look at it, or is there any prosecutory discretion that marginalizes gender dimensioned or gender dimensions in favor of securitized outcomes? So looking at that kind of juxtaposition, I think would help also strengthen. And you spoke also about the ICC and the limitations therein. I think also during my own research, I realized that while the ICC's actions have brought accountability and have been seen as a factor in bringing LRA leaders to the negotiating table, for instance, they have also been criticized for obstructing the peace processes and potentially hindering the integration of lower level combatants. So in this, we are looking, for instance, at the women's voices and priorities, which have been largely marginalized in the peace processes within, with their concerns about the ICC's impact on their communities and the potential for continued suffering. So maybe this could also be another angle to look at when it comes to the limitations of the ICC, and if this could also be, delved into further. I think it's very key. And maybe I would say the last one, and if we have more time, we could look at these other comments that I had. But the issue of intersectionality and victim survivor agency is very key also to your research. And I see that, of course, you're already looking at survivor-centeredness. But while you rightly emphasize the challenges, I think a deeper dive integration into intersectionality, victim survivor experiences such as ethnicity, migration statuses, age, sexuality, could offer a more nuanced lens on how different groups experience and navigate CRSV in a terrorist context. It may help to advocate for further survivor-centered accountability frameworks. And there's a few studies I could share with you on, on survivor-centeredness. And if we look at the essential services packages that I think the UN has put out there, I will be able to share after this meeting. I guess I can always reach out and share some of these to strengthen your literature and any other areas that could be of challenge that you want to enhance. Yeah, I'll leave it at this for that for this time in this moment, Tony, and I'll hand it over back to you.
Okay, thank you. So we'll straight away get to David's discussion, and then after that we'll go to Pilar, and then we'll have the response from Sarah at the end. So David.
Okay, great. First off, thank you so much. This was really interesting. I think it's really interesting, especially for me. I study international law at the very high level, right? The International Criminal Court. And so, as we all know, there's only so much that can happen there. And so it's really, really interesting to hear about the discussions and challenges and small successes that are maybe happening at this more important level with really interesting fieldwork. So I think that's a really wonderful outcome of your fieldwork, and I am excited to see the final project. I'm sure you're also excited to see one day the final project be done. Two quick points. I want to reiterate what was just said about feminist legal methods, because I wonder, I think there's a challenge here, and I think this is just a decision that you need to be more clear about maybe, and that maybe comes across better in your writing. But there is this division in feminist legal approaches between maybe a more positivist approach and a post-positivist or critical approach. And it's clear that you're going with the first, where you are, it seems that you are asserting that there is a correct way to prosecute conflict-related sexual violence, and the conflict-related sexual violence is something that is apparent and you can see it, and it just needs to be corrected, and you can fix the problem, and you can accomplish maybe a perfect prosecution of that. And there are a lot of critical feminist voices that would say that that's not possible. So going back to, for example, your comments about sexual violence as a tactic of war, I think there are some feminists who would disagree that it's always going to be a tactic of war, and that there are a lot of different possibilities that can be reached with that interpretation. And similarly, I think that more importantly, this idea that, right, you're either prosecuting it as terrorism or sexual violence, and there's a correct way to do it. And I think that's really interesting, and I'm not telling you how to write your dissertation, but if you look back to like Rhonda Copeland and some early international feminist legal thinkers, they were really interested in having sexual violence prosecuted as real crimes, right? Before sexual violence was a real crime in the 1990s, saying sexual violence is torture. Please include it as torture, because that we wanted to have the seriousness of torture or maybe terrorism, right, instead of this other category. So I think discussing and talking through some of those nuances, maybe in the introduction of your dissertation, somewhere where we have more time to do it, would be really interesting. So the second question, and this is more of a question, is I'm interested, I think all the comments that were just made about victim interviews are really interesting. I'm also interested in how you interviewed elites. politicians, because I think the thing about sexual violence and as a political phenomenon is that everyone condemns it all the time because it makes you look like a good person, especially if you are an elected official. And so I'm curious if, right, I assume none of the politicians you interviewed were in favor of sexual violence, right? And yet they don't do anything about it, or they're not doing enough about it. And so how did that, right, play into the interpretation? Because you're not just going to accept what they're saying without any critical thought, obviously. So how did you, right, navigate this process of interviewing politicians? So I'll stop there. Thank you so much. And thank you again, Nelman, for this opportunity. This is really great.
Thank you very much, David. And then we'll go to the peer commentator. Pilar, you have the floor.
Okay, so first of all, thank you very much, Sarah, for this research project. It was yeah, it was amazing, to be honest. I learned a lot and I really enjoy it. So I just wanted to say that my background is political science and more specifically quantitative political science. So maybe my comments are not like in line with specifically your topic, but I think that they might be useful. So the first thing that I wanted to ask is more like a kind of conceptual question. So basically here you're exploring this relationship between terrorism and conflict-related sexual violence. And I was thinking, why is it special about terrorism that may make, you know, these changes regarding, I don't know, like how the law treats victims and so on special, right? Especially if you compare it with other kind of groups, like rebel groups that do not commit terrorist acts, right? So what is this difference that I think that maybe you could just explore a bit further in the introduction or just in the beginning? Then I have to comment regarding the results and maybe the overall framing. You mentioned that these results and this analysis that you're conducting in Uganda maybe also expanded to other contexts. I was thinking Nigeria or countries in the Lake Chad basin, but also others beyond Africa. So I was thinking that maybe you could reflect a bit further in that and thinking what does make Uganda maybe a particular case that, you know, that may lead to specific kind of consequences in terms of these law reforms or policy making, or why Uganda may be a representative case, right, to study and then, you know, to generalize these results to other contexts. In either case, I think it's interesting and it's useful. And then my last comment, question, which may be a bit broad, but also because I'm more interested in the political side, I was wondering if these results that you find regarding, for instance, this lack of cumulative charges or this oversight of conflict-related sexual violence, where does it come from, right? It comes from a lack of political will. It comes from, I don't know, limitations in the legislative framework. So even if there is this political will to change things, maybe they can't do this because, you know, there are some limitations in the national or in the international legal framework, or maybe it's, I don't know, because it maybe depends on prosecutorial discretion, or maybe there's not like enough bottom-up pressure to change things. So I would maybe want to know a bit more, if it's possible, right, why it might be driving, you know, these limited effects. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, Sarah, you have the floor.
Okay, so thank you very much, everyone, for all the comments and all the questions. I will try to address and comment on some of the points that you raised. So starting from the last point of what is the main issue in addressing the nexus between sexual and gender-based violence and terrorism in Uganda. As I mentioned, I'm still in the process of analyzing the data that I collected and making my mind and working through it. So I don't think that at this point I have like one final answer. But what I will say is, yes, for sure, there is an issue in the legal framework because there is no legal framework that is comprehensive. But I don't think this is the biggest problem because, as I mentioned, for example, using cumulative charges, it's still possible to make the most of each of the legal framework and combine them to ensure prosecution for the interconnection between these crimes. So I will say that on the one hand, it's probably at the discretion at the prosecutorial stage in terms probably of what charge is easier to prosecute, and even the way that, for example, a crime is perceived. If it's more perceived in the sense of a crimes against specific individuals, then it will be probably lead to a more focus on sexual and gender-based violence charges. But on the other hand, if it's more focused on the terrorism sense of it and the security and terrorism as a crimes against the state, it will lead to a focus more towards terrorist charges. And at the same time, I think there is also a kind of like lack of understanding at the investigative and prosecutorial level, for example, in gathering evidence, but also in what are the main elements to look at them simultaneously to ensure that all the different crimes are prosecuted. And in the sense of the expanding the research to other contexts, so the reason why I chose Uganda, it's because, first of all, it is a post-conflict situation. So looking at the issue of justice in a post-conflict situation is definitely different than in a conflict situation. And this enable a better focus on what are the challenges in investigating and prosecuting crime in a situation of post-conflict. I wouldn't say that all the findings that I will find in relation to Uganda are applicable to all the other countries, but at the same time, Uganda offer a good example in the sense that is as a sort of legal framework that we could look at, but also a specialized institution in the sense of adjudication, the International Criminal Court, and this could make some comparison, either, for example, to other countries to use the same approach, or what are the main challenges, and this is kind of like a more comprehensive example that can be used even in comparison with other countries. This doesn't mean that Uganda is the best example. For example, in terms of legislation, there are other countries in Africa that have more comprehensive legislation, but I would say that by focusing on Uganda and looking at all the different aspects, I'm still able to make some comparison, for example, to what Uganda can improve in comparison to other countries, or what other countries could learn from Uganda, and other recommendations which are more broadly for all the countries. On the question of politicians, actually, this is a very interesting question. The interviews with politicians, I think I had interviews with 3 politicians. I was mostly focusing on the legal framework and what they think are the main strengths in the legal framework, if there are any gaps, and how. So I was trying to be as objective as I could in the question, and in this sense, I was also trying to gain some kind of like information that are pure on the legal framework, but at the same time, obviously, you need to take into account the role, for example, of politician, and as well as any other office. So you need, when you are analyzing your findings, to take into account the positionality of every stakeholder that you are engaging with. In terms of the comments on the methodology and my approach, I am not entirely sure of how I will frame my methodology at the end of my. I will need to rethink about my methodology chapter. What I wanted to do is to use a grounded approach, in the sense that the objective was not going to conducting my fieldwork with something to prove, but more develop my theory based on what I was going to find from my fieldwork. Of course, there are a lot of different perspectives that are related, for example, to the issue of sexual and gender-based violence and sexual and gender-based violence in conflict. The feminist approach is one of these. So in any case, I will need to take into account the feminist approach and frame my own research within the context of the broader literature around it. In the sense of what were the other questions? So in the sense of like ethics, trauma, and stigma, of course, in particular, when engaging with participant of focus group discussion, I had to take into account a lot of ethics consideration and try to favor the well-being of participant as much as I could. I think in this sense, my link with the gatekeeper organization and the fact that the gatekeeper organization had engaged with a lot of communities, of survivors communities in small areas of northern Uganda, was a point in favor of engaging with the participants, because participants had a sort of trust with the organization, and at the same time they were willing to participate, to express themselves, and to engage in the research. At the same time, obviously, we had to ensure that all the interviews were conducted, all the focus group were conducted in a kind of like protect environment. For example, with the focus group that I had with women, they had like the feeling that they could express themselves, but before coming to the focus group, they were kind of scared if, for example, other people could have heard what the discussion was about. Thank you, Zille, for your question. So yes, as I mentioned, I'm still in the middle of my data analysis. I wouldn't say that the findings were particularly surprising. I would say that they gave me a lot of in-depth insight in what are the main challenges, but also the perspective of participants. There are some of the main elements, for example, one of the first slide that I think I put with regard to the findings around the perception of the idea of terrorism and how it is different, for example, with regard to the conflict in northern Uganda and to the conflict in the border with the DRC, but at the same time, the idea that victims have with regard to act of terrorism remain the same. But overall, I think nothing was particularly surprising, but it was very interesting because it gave me a broader perspective, and actually it was surprising in the sense that I gave a lot of insight of things that I could look at that I didn't think about it before. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. Unfortunately, we don't have time anymore, but I'm sure we'll keep in touch. So thank you, Sarah, for an insightful presentation of your project, which certainly developed our understanding of conflict-related sexual violence and the nexus with terrorism. Many thanks to Dr. Pearl, Dr. David, and Pilar for their useful comments, and to everyone who's attended the session. The GlobalSouth Network warmly welcomes PhD students from any discipline and any part of the world to share the projects and receive interdisciplinary feedback. Anyone interested in presenting their work or participating in a session can contact Dr. Nauman Rayat, who is the founder and the convener of the GlobalSouth Network, at the email address provided in the chat box. Same time next week, let's meet our next guest speaker, Bama Andika Butra, who is a PhD candidate in the School of Sociology, Politics, and International Studies, University of Bristol, who will present their PhD project on maritime diplomatic strategies in Southeast Asia, which is going to be the 18th of June 2025 from 3 to 4 UK time. Take care, look after yourselves, and have a wonderful day. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.